Lecture 15, Carolingian Christianity.
Welcome back. In our previous lecture, we examined the reign of Charlemagne, king of the Franks from 768 until 814. We saw how Charlemagne expanded the borders of the Carolingian Empire to the south and the east, conquering northeastern Spain, northern Italy, and Germany between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers. We saw how Charlemagne accepted the imperial title bestowed upon him by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in 800. Today we're going to turn from the political and military history of the Carolingian dynasty to the intellectual and the religious history of Carolingian Europe, because in these realms the Carolingians were going to have important consequences. Carolingian control over the Christian church was just as powerful as the control that had been enjoyed by Roman emperors. And in a way, it was even more vital for Carolingian rulers to control the Christian church than it had been for the Romans or even for their Merovingian predecessors. The Roman government and even the Merovingian government had relied on literate lay people to make it work, to hold the most important offices. Literate lay people who were paid a moneyed salary by their rulers. By the time you get to the Carolingians in the 8th and the 9th century, however, lay literacy had dwindled to a remarkable level. In fact, the words clericus, cleric, and literatus, literate, had become almost synonymous with one another because only clerics are literate, whereas the words laicus in Latin, layperson, and illiteratus, illiterate, had also become synonymous. You will find sentences that seem nonsensical, such as Bishop Frodo was laicus. Bishop was a layperson? That can't make any sense until we realize that the author really means he's illiterate and could not read. Because of the very low levels of lay literacy, Carolingian mayors of the palace and then kings and then emperors had to rely very heavily on clerics to perform important governmental functions. They had to rely on abbots and bishops to draw up their documents for them. They had to rely on priests serving in the royal chapel to draw up charters that would be sent out into Carolingian territory. They had to rely on clerics to be their eyes and ears throughout the empire. And because clerics formed such an important part of the Carolingian bureaucracy, it was important that Carolingian rulers be able to count on these individuals and on the loyalty of these individuals. And the best way for Carolingians to maintain control over these clerics was by gaining the power of appointment to clerical office. If you could appoint someone as a bishop, you had a better chance of being able to count on that person than if the person was elected by the local clergy, for example. The same holds true of abbots in monasteries. Carolingian rulers liked to be able to appoint abbots rather than letting the monks elect the abbot, as should have happened under church rule. And this was also true of popes as well, because Carolingians coveted the power once enjoyed by Byzantine emperors, the power of vetoing papal elections and preventing popes from being consecrated without their approval. Carolingians, in addition to needing to control the clergy, because the clergy play such an important role in running their empire, also wanted the power of appointment because it provided Carolingian rulers with a relatively cheap way of rewarding their followers. It was always painful if you had to reward an important scholar or an important aristocrat with some of your own land, because that diminished your own wealth. But if you could give that person a relatively cushy position as bishop or as abbot someplace, then the person would be grateful to you, but you hadn't really lost anything yourself. So Carolingian rulers had yet another reason for desiring to control the church. This control manifested itself in various ways. The Carolingians succeeded in acquiring the same control over papal elections that the Byzantines had once enjoyed. Louis the Pious, the heir of Charlemagne, in 824 made an agreement with the Pope, known as the Constitutio Romana, and under the terms of this agreement, the Pope agreed that henceforth Only when an emperor had been notified in advance could a pope-elect then receive consecration, precisely the same arrangement that had once existed with the Byzantine Empire. Carolingian kings and emperors routinely summoned church councils in the best Constantinian tradition, and they presided over the sessions of these councils and came down with the final rulings on matters of theology and liturgy. Perhaps the most notorious example of this Carolingian willingness to intervene in theological matters involves the important issue of iconoclasm, which had driven the papacy from the Byzantine Empire in the early 8th century. In 787, a church council was held in the Byzantine Empire at Nicaea, and this most recent council of Nicaea was summoned so that papal representatives and Byzantine representatives could work out a compromise on the issue of iconoclasm, come up with some statement about the place of religious images in Christianity that would be acceptable both to popes and to Byzantine emperors. For once, negotiations worked, and papal representatives and Byzantine officials were able to come up with a single formulation about the place of the veneration of religious images within Christianity. And it looked like a notable victory for the papacy because the final compromise was very close to the original papal position, which is that religious images do have an important place within churches and within individuals' religious lives. No Frankish bishops had been invited to the Council of Nicaea. This was because the Byzantines regarded Frankish bishops as so intellectually inferior, they're barbarian bishops, that they could not possibly have anything to contribute to our discussions. The Franks were rather resentful of the fact that they had been excluded, and Charlemagne was not at all pleased that the papacy and the Byzantine Empire seemed to be drawing closer together and had agreed on a common policy about iconoclasm. What to do? Well, Charlemagne summons his own council, the Council of Frankfurt, held in 794, also attended by papal representatives, but with Frankish bishops predominating. And the Council of Frankfurt condemned the Council of Nicaea at 787. It very badly misstated what the Council of Nicaea had agreed upon with regard to the place of icons and other religious images in Christianity. It claimed that the Council of Nicaea had permitted the outright worship of images, which no Christian would have countenanced. And indirectly, the Pope is condemned by the Council of Frankfurt for having given his approval to the Council of Nicaea in 787. On orders from Charlemagne, the Pope, Hadrian I, who comes before Leo III, gives his approval to the Council of Frankfurt and is forced to join in the condemnation of the Council of Nicaea and to toe the Carolingian line on the matter of iconoclasm. In addition to maintaining a fairly strict control over the Carolingian Church, the Carolingians also supported missionary activity among the pagans living to the east of the Carolingian Empire. And they supported this missionary activity from a very early date. Already in the late 7th century and early 8th century, Carolingians would provide logistical support and guarantees of protection to missionaries who are willing to go and work among the Saxons and other Germanic peoples. The missionaries themselves, however, were not Franks. The missionaries who worked among the Saxons and other groups such as the Frisians were usually Anglo-Saxons, Anglo-Saxons from England. The Anglo-Saxons from England often suggested to the Carolingians that it might be a good thing for the Carolingians to support their missionary activities. They had a keen interest in going back to what was, for them, the old country. This is where they had come from, and to try and convert to Christianity those Saxons who had remained behind and had not come to Anglo-Saxon England in the 5th century. There were still very close cultural and linguistic connections between the Anglo-Saxons in England and the Saxons in Germany, and so in some ways they were ideal candidates to try and spread Christianity among the Saxons. The Carolingians, in general, were willing to give their support to Anglo-Saxon missionaries, especially in the form of guarantees of protection. If the Saxons were to kill the missionaries, the Carolingians would come and kill the Saxons. Perhaps the first important Anglo-Saxon missionary to work among the Germans is someone by the name of Willibrord, who dies in 739. He's an Anglo-Saxon who'd spent some time in Ireland, and Willibrord arrived on the European continent in 690, and he approached the Carolingian mayor of the palace, Pepin II, and asked him for his support. Pepin II agreed to this, and Willibrord went to work among a group known as the Frisians. The Frisians were pagans who lived at the mouth of the Rhine River along the North Sea. And they were very important for the commercial life of the North Sea. They often acted as merchants shipping goods back and forth between England and the continent. The Carolingians' decision to support Willibrord was not entirely disinterested, because the Carolingians and the Frisians had long been rivals for control of one of the most important port towns on the North Sea. It was a place called Dorstadt. And the Carolingians hoped that if the Frisians accepted Christianity, especially Christianity at the hands of a missionary supported by the Carolingians, this might allow the Carolingians to claim overlordship of the Frisians and gain control of Dorstadt. Willibrord went to work among the Frisians, and at first he enjoyed some success. He managed to convince the king of the Frisians, someone by the name of Radbod, who dies in 719, to undergo baptism. And in general, once you got a king to convert, the king's followers would then do the same. That had been the experience in Anglo-Saxon England. The baptism, however, did not go well. As Radbod was preparing to step into the baptismal font, because to be baptized at this point you have to undergo total immersion, a question occurred to him. He asked Willibrord whether, after death, he would see his deceased ancestors in heaven. Willibrord said, no, they're not there. They were pagans. They were not baptized, and they're in hell. Radbod stepped out of the baptismal font and refused to go through with the ceremony, claiming he could not bear to be separated from his kin in this manner. He would rather spend all eternity in hell with his ancestors than all eternity in heaven with strangers like, well, Willibrord. Oh, so close. Willibrord had to go back to the Franks and explain what had happened, and the conversion of the Frisians was going to have to await their military conquest by the Franks. When Charles Martel decisively defeated the Frisians in 734, Willibrord returned, went back to work, and this time succeeded slowly in converting the Frisians to Christianity. Willibrord had an associate whose name was Winfrith, another Anglo-Saxon. Winfrith dies in 754. And as a relatively young man in 719, Winfrith traveled to Rome. And while he was there, he decided to get rid of his old Anglo-Saxon name and adopt a more Roman-sounding name. He takes the name of Boniface for himself, and he's usually known as Boniface. Boniface picks up where Willibrord left off upon his death. Boniface, until 754, is the most important missionary working among the Saxons and other Germanic peoples. Boniface, too, had to rely on guarantees of Frankish protection in order to travel safely among the Saxons, and his relationship with the Carolingians was often rather tense. He was a harsh critic of the Carolingian Church, which the Carolingians themselves admitted needed some reform, and he suspects that the Carolingians' interest in baptism of pagans was not purely religious, and his suspicions were in fact correct. Boniface established many monasteries in Saxon territory to serve as a base for further missionary efforts. Perhaps the most famous is a monastery at a place called Fulda, and he also established bishoprics, episcopal sees, places where bishops could supervise the religious life of the territories under their jurisdiction. He establishes a bishopric at Mainz, for example. In addition to trying to create an ecclesiastical infrastructure with bishops and abbots in pagan territory, he also tried to discredit paganism, and one of his most famous actions came in the 730s. There was an important pagan shrine in German territory that went by various names, one of which was the Oak of Thunor. It was a huge tree, the biggest tree that people had seen, which pagans worshipped. Boniface decided that a good way to discredit paganism would be to cut this thing down. And so, surrounded by guards, he went and he sawed down the Oak of Thunor, daring the pagan gods to zap him as he was doing so. He did not get zapped, to the astonishment of the pagans, and indeed, to add insult to injury, used the wood of the Oak of Thunor to build a Christian church. In the end, Boniface was killed, not by lightning sent by the gods, but by pirates. In 754, he's ambushed, and even though the pirates were probably trying to rob him rather than to kill him because he was a missionary, he was nonetheless hailed as a martyr. The efforts of Boniface, despite the audacity of the cutting down of the Oak of Thunor, were not all that successful in convincing the Saxons of the errors of their ways. And it was not until Charlemagne's time and the military conquest of the Saxons that Christianity begins to make any serious headway among the Saxons. Charlemagne's policy, as I mentioned, was to convert first, just to make sure that everyone got baptized at the end of a campaign, and then later to send missionaries among the Saxons to explain the religion to which they had just joined. And not surprisingly, the Christianity of the Saxons was going to be at first somewhat on the superficial side, since they didn't really know what they were going into. The Carolingians would also attempt to stamp out various pagan practices. Cremation of the dead, for example, has to stop, and the dead have to be buried in Christian land. Sometimes the Carolingians require the Saxons to dig up people who had already been buried and transport the corpses to Christian graveyards. Holding giant feasts on the anniversary of the death of an ancestor at that ancestor's grave is also another common pagan practice that the Carolingians attempt to stamp out among the Saxons. Despite the methods used by Charlemagne, the fact that he instructs after baptism, Charlemagne and the missionaries whom he supports do succeed in moving the eastern boundary between paganism and Christianity from the Rhine River, where it had been at the start of his reign, to the Elbe River, where it will remain until the time of the Crusades. One text in particular tells us a great deal about what the conversion of the Saxons entailed, and some of the ways in which the Carolingians, seemingly inflexible in so many ways, such as enforcing the Saxons to dig up their dead and move them, were in fact somewhat flexible in their approach to Christianity as it's presented to the Saxons. In the first half of the 9th century, a version of the Christian gospel is translated into Old Saxon, apparently so that the Saxons had a better understanding of Christianity, could read it for themselves. This version of the gospel, this Old Saxon version, is called the Heliond, and it's one of the earliest works of German literature. And in the Heliond, the entire gospel is rewritten in the form of a Norse saga or Germanic heroic literature with some strange consequences for the gospels themselves. Take, for example, the passage in the Gospel of Luke regarding the arrest of Jesus of Nazareth in the Garden of Gethsemane. Here's the Revised Standard Version of that particular passage. Jesus went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why do you sleep? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And when those who were about him saw what would follow, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. But Jesus said no more of this, and he touched his ear and healed him. Here is the version of the arrest of Jesus of Nazareth in the Garden of Gethsemane contained in the Saxon Gospel. It appears under the following titles: Song 57, Christ's deep fear before battle, his last salute in the garden. Song 58, Christ the chieftain is captured, Peter the mighty swordsman defends him boldly. Now here's the passage itself. Christ's warrior companions saw warriors coming up the mountain, making a great din, angry armed men. Judas, the hate-filled man, was showing them the way. The enemy clan, the Jews, were marching behind. The warriors marched forward, the grim Jewish army, until they had come to Christ. There he stood, the famous chieftain. Christ's followers, wise men deeply distressed by this hostile action, held their position in front. They spoke to their chieftain. "My lord chieftain," they said, "if it should now be your will that we be impaled here on their spear points, wounded by their weapons, then nothing would be so good to us as to die here, pale from mortal wounds for our chieftain." Then Simon Peter, the mighty, the noble swordsman, flew into a rage. His mind was in such turmoil that he could not speak a single word. His heart became intensely bitter because they wanted to tie up his Lord there. So he strode over angrily, that very daring thane or nobleman, to stand in front of his commander, right in front of his Lord. No doubting in his mind, no fearful hesitation in his chest, he drew his blade and struck straight ahead at the first man of the enemy with all the strength in his hands, so that Malchus was cut and wounded on the right side by the sword. His ear was chopped off. He was so badly wounded in the head that his cheek and ear burst open with the mortal wound. Blood gushed out, pouring from the wound. The men stood back. They were afraid of the slash of the sword. The author of the Helion took some liberties with the gospel in recounting how Jesus of Nazareth was arrested. Jesus of Nazareth is not a chieftain, at least not as the Saxons would have understood the term, nor are the Jews a clan. The disciples are not warrior companions, and Simon Peter is a fisherman, not a Nordic berserker. The gospel account does not dwell upon the injury inflicted by Simon Peter, much less glorify it as one of the most amazing head wounds ever suffered, worthy of a highlight reel. And in order to gain Saxon acceptance of Christianity, the Helion suggests that, compromises were made. The whole point of the gospel story is that Jesus said, "Stop it," and healed the individual who had been struck by the sword. But to a Saxon, what kind of God would not resist being arrested by one's enemies? And why would one want to pray to such a God? In addition to supporting missionary activity, the Carolingians also attempted to reform the Carolingian Church. And the Carolingian Church needed reform, according to Carolingian reformers, for a number of different reasons. But perhaps the most important of them was the fact that many members of the upper ranks of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the bishops and the abbots within the Frankish world, came from an aristocratic background and found it difficult to give up the aristocratic lifestyle. They loved hunting, for example. They loved fighting and going to war. And it was not unknown for them to be married and have families. One Carolingian bishop described his life in this way: "In the winter, I do not get a single moment of leisure to devote myself to studies, for I am always en route to the palace. Then is the spring when, with my parchments under my arm, I go down to the coast to fight the Muslims. By day, I put my sword to the work. By night, I employ my books and my pen." According to canon law, bishops are not supposed to take part in warfare, but for many aristocrats, this was a way of life, and they found it hard to give up old habits upon becoming bishops and abbots. In order to improve the condition of the church within Frankish territories, the Carolingians created what is going to remain the basic framework of Christianity in Europe even to this day, the parish system. There had been parishes in Europe before the Carolingian period, but there was no regular system of parishes. Many areas had no parishes. Many parishes had no church, no local priest to say mass for people. The Carolingians wanted to regularize the system of parishes and to extend it everywhere so that everyone had access to a church, that everyone had access to a parish priest. And in 765, Pepin the Short ordered that each diocese, which is an area governed by a bishop, should be divided up into parishes, usually one per village. Each parish is to have its own church and its own priest so that people can receive regular religious instruction. In practice, it was difficult to build all of these churches and to staff them properly, but nonetheless, the number of parishes does increase. The number of churches likewise increases under the Carolingians, and the parish becomes the norm, and a lack of a parish and a parish priest becomes the exception. Such a massive increase in the number of churches and parishes, however, required financing. Who's going to pay for all of this, and who's going to support all of these local priests? Carolingians extended and regularized something known as the tithe. A tithe, in Latin the decima, is a mandatory payment that Christians have to make to their local parish church, amounting to 1/10 of personal revenue, or it might be 1/10 of all the turnips you grow, 1/10 of all the sheep that you own, given annually. And the tithe system is intended to maintain these churches and their priests. In practice, the tithing does not extend throughout the whole of the Carolingian Empire. It's difficult to impose. But tithing does become more widespread, and it becomes a source of a great deal of resentment on the part of some lay Christians because it's a mandatory payment. It's not a collection plate that's put in front of you, which you may or may not contribute to. You have to do this, and if you don't, you are subjected not just to ecclesiastical sanctions and penance. Secular officials will arrest you, and they will confiscate your property for not contributing to it. And some Christians felt that mandatory payments, such as tithes, was not proper. In addition to reforming the system of parishes, trying to create many new churches for the Carolingian Empire, the Carolingians were also interested in reforming monastic life. And the individuals who are most responsible for monastic reform would be Louis the Pious, the heir of Charlemagne, and a monk by the name of Benedict of Aniane, who dies in 821 and should not be confused with Benedict of Nursia, who draws up the rule of St. Benedict in the first half of the 6th century. As for what the problem was with monastic life, well, the Irish and Anglo-Saxon monks who came to the continent in the 7th century had created a more austere form of monasticism, and monasteries were founded out in the countryside, separated from the world. But over time, there was a tendency for monasteries that started out with very high standards to lapse into ever more lax behavior. It was difficult to maintain discipline. And there was a proliferation of different monastic rules, and this made discipline hard to maintain because monasteries looking for an easier life, not having to say as many prayers, for example, not having to fast as often, could pick and choose among these various rules, and they would take one chapter from one rule and another from another rule and cobble together something that allowed them to live rather easily. Benedict of Aniane, whose original name was Wititza, is actually a Goth, not a Frank. He came from the region of Aquitaine in the far southwest of France. And he attempts to join the monastery and finds that the monks living there are not really praying as often as they should be or maintaining monastic discipline. And so in 780 he abandoned this monastery to go live as a hermit on his father's lands. But in a case of deja vu all over again, just as happened with Antony, followers come after him, and so as a result he has to found a monastery at Aniane for him and his followers. What made Aniane remarkable was the fact that Benedict of Aniane imposed the rule of St. Benedict on this monastery and followed it to the letter. He would not allow his monks to deviate from the rule of St. Benedict, and he comes to the attention of Louis the Pious, who sees this as a good thing and wants to model all of the monasteries in the Carolingian world after this monastery at Anian, and he relies on Benedict of Anian to carry through this reform. In 816 and again in 817, Louis the Pious makes a determined effort to extend the reforms that Benedict had imposed at Anian on all the monasteries of the empire. He requires all these monasteries to get a copy of the rule of Saint Benedict for themselves, to follow this rule and only this rule, not to borrow elements from other monastic rules, and to follow this rule to the letter. As always, the achievements do not match up to the ideals. Certainly not every monastery gets the rule of St. Benedict or follows it to the letter, but many do. And from the Carolingian period onward, Benedictine monasticism, based on the rule of St. Benedict, does become the norm in Europe. In conclusion, Carolingian rulers control the church quite strictly. They sponsor Anglo-Saxon missionaries in neighboring pagan territories, and they attempt to reform the church both through the creation of a system of parishes and through reforming monastic life. But in addition to purely religious reform, the Carolingians were also interested in sponsoring scholarship, and their interest in scholarship was quite closely tied to their religious interests, as we'll see in our next lecture.